The record was stamped with a time of death before the war had even started. That was the detail that Arbiter Thesivane could not explain. The single line at the bottom of the Terran diplomatic transmission, submitted 14 minutes before the Council's formal declaration, had been read aloud in chambers. A timestamp that should have been impossible. A timestamp that implied the humans had known, not suspected, not feared, known. Thesivane set the transmission down on the crystalline surface of their desk and said nothing for a long time. The document was otherwise unremarkable, a standard acknowledgement of hostilities, procedurally correct, formally polite, the kind of response a civilization sends when it has accepted that dialogue has ended and wishes to appear composed for the historical record. But that timestamp, 14 minutes before. Thesivane had commanded 3 wars, had written the legal architecture for 2 planetary annexations, had never once in 47 years of galactic jurisprudence encountered a document that predicted its own cause before its cause existed. So they did what any rational arbiter would do. They buried it in a footnote, classified the transmission, and voted yes on the declaration. That was the first mistake. It would not be the last. The war was supposed to take 11 days. That estimate came from the Strategic Directorate's own models, the most sophisticated predictive military framework the Galactic Council had ever commissioned, calibrated against 612 prior conflict resolutions. 11 days from declaration to planetary pacification. The humans would be given 48 hours to negotiate terms of unconditional surrender. When they inevitably declined, the models assigned a 94.7% probability to refusal because humans were empirically bad at accepting reality. The fleet would advance. Orbital superiority would be established in 72 hours. Ground compliance would follow within the week. The whole sequence had the comfortable weight of foregone conclusion. Fleet Commander Vora Thesson reviewed the models 3 times on the transit to the Terran system. He was a methodical being, hexaptal, with cognitive architecture that processed information in parallel streams. He could evaluate 6 simultaneous tactical scenarios without losing coherence in any. The Council had chosen him specifically because he was not the kind of commander who made emotional decisions. He did not hate humanity. He did not fear it. He simply intended to end it, efficiently and without malice, the way a surgeon ends an infection. The population projections for post-pacification retention, said his second, Drevalik, sliding a data tile across the command bridge. The Council has amended the parameters. They want 80% labor viability preserved. That was always the intent, Vora Thesson said, without looking up. They are specifying it now formally. In writing, Drevalik paused, which suggests they expect there to be surviving humans who require documentation of protection status. Or it suggests the Council's legal division is being thorough. Don't search for deeper meaning in administrative procedure. Of course, another pause, Commander, the 48-hour window opens in 6 hours. I'm aware. And if they surrender? Vora Thesson finally looked up. 6 eyes, arranged in a wide ellipse, focused on Drevalik with something that wasn't quite condescension but lived in the same neighborhood. They won't. The second mistake had just been made, not the refusal to consider surrender, the assumption that refusal would look like defiance. The human response to the 48-hour ultimatum arrived in 31 minutes. Not 31 hours, 31 minutes. The transmission was brief. It was structurally not a rejection. It was not a counteroffer. It was not a declaration of resistance or a statement of principle or any of the 47 response categories the Strategic Directorate's models had been designed to process. It was a question: who will be held accountable for the declaration? That was the entirety of the message. 11 words in the interstellar common tongue, rendered with grammatically impeccable precision, submitted with an attached legal filing 43 pages long that cited council compact provisions from 3 different centuries, cross-referenced with 17 precedent resolutions, and formally requested a named respondent for purposes of what the humans called a matter of lasting institutional record. Vorathesen read it twice. Then he forwarded it to the council's legal division without comment. 3 hours later, legal sent back a single-line response. This is a bureaucratic delaying tactic. Proceed as scheduled. He did. The fleet entered the outer Terran system at 600 Council Standard Time, and that is when the third mystery arrived. Not with alarm klaxons, not with weapons fire, but with a silence that the sensors could not explain. Because the sensors were designed to detect things. Mass energy, electromagnetic signatures, heat. And the human orbital installations weren't gone. They were cold. Every single one of them. Powered down. Not destroyed, not evacuated, cold in the way that something goes cold when it has been carefully, deliberately, methodically cooled to remove any thermal signature. Every satellite, every platform, every relay beacon. As if the entire orbital infrastructure of a planet with 11 billion inhabitants had simply gone quiet. They're hiding, Drevlik said. From sensors that can detect a single ship across 4 light years, Vorathesen replied. Then they don't understand our sensor capabilities. That was what everyone concluded, the obvious, rational answer. The humans were attempting concealment using technology that couldn't possibly conceal them. It was almost pitiable. It took 19 hours to realize they weren't hiding. The discovery came through a maintenance report, which is perhaps the least dramatic way in galactic history to learn that you have been catastrophically wrong about something. A junior sensor operator, Kesvel, 22 years old, first deployment, a species whose homeworld smelled permanently of copper and rain, flagged an anomaly in the thermal null data. Not an anomaly in what was detected, an anomaly in the asterisk shape of what wasn't. The cooling signatures, Kesvel said, approaching Drevlik with the nervous energy of someone delivering news they desperately hoped was wrong. They're not random. Drevlik looked at the data tile, then looked again. These installations were shut down in sequence. Yes, a precise sequence. The timing intervals are not consistent with an emergency power down or an evacuation protocol. Kesvel's secondary fingers tapped against the tile's edge. They were shut down in an order that creates a specific electromagnetic shadow, a shape. A shape that means what? A longer pause than was comfortable. Our sensor array reads it as null space, a volume of the inner system that our sensors report as empty, but the shape of the empty space is, Kesvel stopped. Finish the sentence. It matches the dispersal pattern of the Vorathesen fleet formation. Commander, they cooled their infrastructure in the exact geometric negative of our approach vector. They didn't hide from the sensors. They aimed the sensors at themselves and removed everything that would create contrast. We're looking at the Terran system, the way you look at a painting in a dark room with only the painting as your light source. Kesvel set the tile down. We cannot see what is behind them. The silence on the bridge was a specific kind of silence. The kind that exists at the precise moment a person realizes they have walked into a room and the door behind them has closed. All stop, Vorathesen said very quietly. All stop now. The fleet decelerated, and in the 6 minutes it took to do so, 17 objects that had been coasting on ballistic trajectories, cold, dark, unpowered, indistinguishable from the background debris of the inner asteroid belt, passed through the center of the fleet formation and out the other side. Undetected because they were cold. Because the humans had taught the fleet to look in exactly the wrong direction. None of the 17 objects detonated. None of them did anything. They just passed through, silent and patient, and continued on their trajectories into empty space. And that was somehow worse than if they'd exploded. Because Vorathesson stood on his bridge and understood, with the particular clarity of a tactical mind confronting something that doesn't fit any model, that the humans had just demonstrated they could have killed him, and chosen not to, and he could not, for the life of him, determine why. The council's communiqué arrived 4 hours later. It was impatient in the way that powerful institutions become impatient when reality declines to behave according to schedule. Fleet has exceeded the projected 48-hour pacification window by 11 hours. Explain delay. Vorathesson composed his response carefully. He wrote 6 drafts. The final version said, "The humans have demonstrated unexpected tactical sophistication, requesting 48-hour extension to reassess approach parameters." The Council's reply, denied. Strategic Directorate models do not support reassessment. Proceed. He looked at that response for a long time. Then he looked at Drevlik. "They don't know about the 17 objects," Drevlik said. "No. Should we tell them?" Vorathesson thought about the timestamp, the one at the bottom of the original Terran transmission, 14 minutes before the declaration. "Not yet," he said. "Let's understand it first. And if we can't understand it before we're ordered to advance, then we advance," he said, "and we hope understanding comes quickly." It didn't. The first ground engagement was on a continent the humans called Europe, a word that Drevlik's translation matrix rendered as something close to the place we began, which Drevlik noted in a log entry and then forgot about. It would have been worth remembering. The landing force was 12,000 strong. The Strategic Directorate had modeled expected resistance at between 4 and 7% of the landing zone perimeter, organized defensive positions, conventional projectile and energy-based weaponry, standard guerrilla logistics. What the landing force found was a city that had been systematically evacuated except for approximately 3,000 people, elderly, ill, or volunteers, who had stayed behind with orders that no one in the landing force understood until hours later. These 3,000 people did not fight. They did not flee. They moved through the occupation zone with complete normalcy, cooking food, tending to buildings, maintaining utilities, as if the 12,000 soldiers were a minor inconvenience rather than an invading force. "They are not combatants," the ground commander, Field Marshal Przvek, reported back, confusion audible even across the compression codec. "They are domestically occupied. I have one woman who offered my forward scouting unit something called tea." "Did your unit accept?" Vorathesson asked. A pause that told its own story. "2 of them did, sir. It was, I want to be clear that my unit is fully combat capable and this does not represent." "I'm not questioning combat capability, Przvek. What did the tea taste like?" "I am told it was adequate, sir. The issue is what we are not finding. Our models projected organized resistance. What we have is an occupied city where no one is resisting. I cannot pacify a population that is simply going about its day." "Understood. Maintain position. Do not advance without my order." Przvek hesitated. "There's one more thing, the 3,000 who stayed." A longer pause. "They've all been photographed, individual images with identification documents. They submitted them to us proactively as a group before we asked, before we even established a processing protocol." He sounded genuinely unsettled, which for a being who had pacified 3 planets was notable. "Commander, they documented themselves, like they want a permanent record of being there." Vorathesson filed that information in the part of his brain that was accumulating things he did not understand about humans and was becoming alarmingly full. "Hold position," he said. "Hold." The 43rd hour. That was when the world shifted, and everything that had come before rearranged itself into a new and terrible configuration. A Council intelligence analyst, one of the few who had actually studied Terran history rather than simply modeling Terran behavior, submitted a report that no one in the Strategic Directorate had requested. The analyst's name was Vorith. They worked a night shift in a department that was technically responsible for cultural anthropology, which the directorate considered decorative rather than functional. Vorith's report was 4 pages long. The cover note said only, "I believe we have misidentified what kind of war this is." The report itself was structured around a single observation. In Terran history, specifically, the period the humans themselves identified as their most formative, there existed a recurring military doctrine that no other spacefaring species had independently developed. The Council had scanned Terran historical databases and cataloged their wars, their weapons, their tactics, but the analysts had categorized those wars using frameworks built around Council member species' conflict patterns. Objective, territory, resources, capitulation threshold. They had never asked what the humans were actually doing in their wars. Vorith had asked. The answer, laid out across 4 pages of painstaking historical cross-reference, was this: when facing an overwhelmingly superior force, human civilizations did not primarily attempt to defeat that force. They attempted to make the cost of victory so catastrophically high, economically, politically, reputationally, temporally, that the force chose to stop, not because they lost, because they won at a price that destroyed something essential about what they were fighting for. The humans called this in various historical formulations: the Long War, the War of Attrition, the Insurgency, the Resistance. Vorith underlined one particular sentence from a human military theorist, someone named T.E. Lawrence, dead for hundreds of years, whose words had been sitting in the Council's own database unread. Granted mobility, security, time, and doctrine, the contest was as inevitable as to be almost bloodless. Mobility, security, time, doctrine. The evacuated cities were not retreat. The cold orbital installations were not concealment. The 3,000 who stayed behind were not surrender. The 17 objects that had passed through the fleet and done nothing were not a failed attack. They were an opening statement, a declaration of terms that the Council had received in full and failed to read. The 48-hour surrender window had not been a deadline for humanity. It had been a deadline for the Council, and the humans had let it expire because they had already decided they would not be fighting the war the Council expected. Vorith read Vorith's report in 11 minutes. Then he called the Council on an emergency channel and said 5 words that his career had not previously required. "We need to stop. Now." The Council's response, the chairman himself, a being of extraordinary composure and institutional confidence, was almost gentle. "Commander Vorith, you have a fleet of 400 vessels in orbit of an unshielded planet with a pre-industrial scale defensive capability. You are requesting a pause because a cultural analyst has submitted a philosophical essay about ancient Terran warfare. The 17 objects were cold rocks, very likely, or a demonstration of capability for psychological effect. Your models projected 94.7% probability of capitulation within the first 72 hours. You are now at 43 hours. Proceed." Vorith said nothing for 3 seconds, then, "On record." A fractional pause from the chairman. "Yes, on record, proceed." He proceeded. "The next 6 weeks were the education. That is the only word that fits. Not a war. An education. A systematic, patient, extraordinarily costly curriculum delivered by 11 billion students who had apparently decided that the most important thing they could teach was not how to fight, but what it costs to occupy a species that has decided, collectively and without exception, that it will not be occupied. It began with infrastructure, not destroyed, maintained. The humans kept their power grids running, their water systems operational, their communication networks functional, but they ran them. Every repair, every maintenance procedure, every operational decision flowed through human hands that the occupying forces could not fully replace and could not fully control. Vorathessen's commanders requested technical manuals. The humans provided them, incomplete, in versions that were accurate but assumed background knowledge that the occupiers didn't have. Equipment worked until it didn't, and when it didn't, the only people who could fix it were the humans who were willing to at a price, and that price was never money. They want documentation, Przvek reported from the European zone, his tone carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been trying to occupy a city for 3 weeks and had mostly succeeded in becoming deeply familiar with its plumbing. Every interaction, every agreement. They want witnesses, signatures, cross-referenced records with timestamps. My administrative staff is drowning. They want a record, Vorathessen said. Yes, but a record of what? We're fixing a water pumping station. Why does that need 17 witnesses and a certified document? Vorathessen thought about the 3,000 who had photographed themselves before the occupation. Because they're building something, he said. We just don't know what yet. Meanwhile, in the spaces between occupied zones, the mountains, the forests, the vast stretches of territory that 12,000 ground troops per continent simply could not meaningfully hold, something was being organized with a patience and a quietness that the sensors couldn't quite catch. Not weapon stockpiles, not military formations. The heat signatures were wrong for both. Small gatherings, medical equipment, communication relays. Libraries, actual physical libraries, being relocated to distributed underground positions with the care of people who expected to need them in a long time. A human commander, the first one Vorathessen ever heard named, made contact on week 4, not with a military channel, with the administrative frequency that the occupation forces used for infrastructure coordination. A voice, female by human phonological classification, calm in the way that a deep river is calm. This is General Mara Voss, the voice said. I'm reaching you because I want to avoid a specific kind of misunderstanding. Drevlik nearly dropped the communication tile. Vorathessen took it from him. General Voss, I'll admit this is unexpected. I imagine. You've been trying to locate me for 3 weeks. I've been about 40 kilometers from your primary European operations base. I wanted you to know that before we continue, so we're operating from accurate information. 40 kilometers. He had 3,000 soldiers within 40 kilometers of her position and had not found her. What misunderstanding are you hopping to avoid? The one where you conclude that what's happening is guerrilla resistance with a conventional endgame, where you assume that we're building toward a moment where we ask for terms. A pause, just long enough to be deliberate. We're not. Then what are you building toward? Toward the moment when the Council explains to its member species why this war is still happening, and what it costs, and who is paying for it, and whether that's what they agreed to when they voted for a declaration. Another pause. We filed that legal document in the first 31 minutes. We named the accountable parties. We cross-referenced the compact. That document is sitting in a council archive right now, properly filed, timestamped, formally received. We just need time for the rest of the council to find it. Vorathessen sat very still. The timestamp, the document, the 14 minutes. How long have you been planning this? Commander. Her voice carried something, not quite warmth, not quite amusement, harder than both. We've been planning this since the first time we watched a stronger civilization tell a smaller one that it had no right to continue existing. We've had a long time to think about how to answer that argument. The line closed. Drevlik looked at Vorathessen. She's been 40 kilometers away for 3 weeks. Yes. And she called us. Yes. Why? Vorathessen thought about it. Because she wanted us to know she could have called at any time, that she chose not to, that this call was a decision she made on her schedule, not ours. He set down the tile. She's not telling us about the war, Drevlik. She's showing us something about themselves, about what they're willing to do with time. He paused. I think they believe they have more of it than we do. The legal filing detonated. That was the word that eventually appeared in the historical record, asterisk detonated at week 7. It was found not by a council legal analyst, but by a junior member of the Keth Confederation delegation, a species with 6,000 years of historical grievances against council overreach who had voted reluctantly for the declaration, and had been experiencing increasing institutional heartburn about it since. The filing was not buried. It was not hidden. It was right where the humans had put it, in the public archive, openly accessible, waiting with the patience of something that had been built to wait. It named 11 council members personally. It cited the compact's founding charter. It presented, with the meticulous cross-referenced evidence of a species that had apparently spent considerable time studying galactic law, a case that the declaration of war constituted an unlawful application of collective force against a non-aggressive civilization on the basis of preemptive threat assessment, a legal category that the Council's own charter prohibited except under specific conditions that had not been met, could not be demonstrated to have been met, and whose absence had been noted and formally objected to by the human diplomatic mission 14 minutes before the declaration was read. 14 minutes before. The humans had filed their legal challenge asterisk before the declaration was made because they had obtained, through means the Council spent 3 months trying to understand and never fully did, a copy of the declaration's final draft before it was officially transmitted. They had known. They had documented their knowledge. They had created an unbroken chain of evidence that began before the war did and extended forward through every interaction, every signed document, every photographed witness, every recorded infrastructure agreement. They had not been building a resistance. They had been building a case. The case was airtight, not because the humans were better lawyers than the Council, though it was becoming clear they were, alarmingly, quite good, but because the humans had understood something about the Council's structure that the Council's own members had not fully internalized. The Compact's enforcement mechanisms were not controlled by the Council. They were controlled by a rotating tribunal of member species, and those member species had their own grievances, their own long memories, their own filed documents that had been waiting in archives for a very long time. 3 species moved simultaneously to activate the tribunal. The message from the Council chairman came to Vorathesson at hour 178 of the occupation. It was brief. It said, "Cease all ground operations. Return to orbital position. Maintain no hostile posture. Await instructions." He read it on his bridge with Drevlik standing beside him, both of them looking out at the blue-white curve of the human planet, still spinning, still lit, its cities still running on infrastructure that humans maintained and controlled and had never actually surrendered. "That's it," Drevlik said. "That's it. We're stopping. We're stopping." Drevlik processed this for a moment. Przvek's forces have been in field for 7 weeks. We've lost 4 patrol units to accidents in terrain our soldiers weren't equipped for. We've spent, he checked the resource tile, an amount that I will describe as considerable in time, materiel, and political capital. And we're stopping because of a legal filing that the humans submitted in the first 31 minutes. Yes. Did we lose? Vorathesson considered the question with genuine care. We didn't lose militarily. We never actually fought a military engagement. He watched the planet turn. We lost something else. The thing we came here to take. The narrative. The Council told its member species this would be 11 days. We are at week 7. Every day past 11 was evidence being added to the human file. Every interaction Przvek had with the population was a documented exchange. Every resource we spent was a line item being tallied somewhere by a species that apparently understands, at an instinctive level, that in a long enough timeline, legitimacy is more powerful than force. They weaponize time, Drevlik said quietly. And paperwork, Vorathesson said. It sounded absurd. It wasn't. And patience. and the near-incomprehensible willingness to sit for 7 weeks under occupation, maintain their own infrastructure, document everything, and wait for a legal process to resolve in their favor rather than pick up a weapon and give us justification to use ours. How did they know the tribunal would rule for them? Vorathesson thought about the timestamp again, the 14 minutes, the filing, the 43 pages of citations. Because they studied the compact longer and more carefully than the council members who wrote it, and because they had, at some point, I don't know when, maybe long before we noticed them, decided that if they were ever going to fight a war against a galactic power, they were going to fight it in the arena where they had the best chance of winning. He paused. They're patient, Drevlik, extraordinarily patient. They think in generations. General Maravas made contact one more time. Not on the administrative channel, on the commander's personal frequency, a channel that required a specific encryption key that she should not have had. Vorathesson answered. The tribunal ruling comes through in approximately 6 hours, she said. I want to speak before it does, while we're still technically at war in whatever form this has been. Speak. Your commander's in the field, Przvek specifically. He had opportunities to escalate that he didn't take. He behaved with more restraint than his orders required. Some of the people who stayed in the cities, the 3,000 I mentioned, they noticed. She was quiet for a moment. I want that noted somewhere, not publicly, just registered, because we notice when people choose restraint when they don't have to. Vorathesson said nothing for a long time. General, the 17 objects that passed through my fleet formation in the first hours. Yes. They were armed. It wasn't a question, she didn't treat it like one. Yes. And you chose not to detonate them. Yes. Because you needed us intact long enough for the legal process to work. A pause that contained something he could only describe as wait. Commander, we chose not to detonate them because we didn't want to. There's a difference. We're not a species that enjoys killing. We never have been, despite what our history suggests to outside observers. A breath. We're a species that has learned the hard way over a very long time with a very high body count that the only wars worth winning are the ones you can survive afterward, where there's something left to build. And if the tribunal had ruled against you, the silence this time was different, longer, more considered. When she spoke, her voice was the same calm, deep river calm, but underneath it, for the first time, he could hear the thing she'd been keeping in reserve. The thing that had been sitting in the dark, cold and patient, like 17 objects on a ballistic trajectory. Then we would have found another way, Commander. We always do. We have been finding other ways for as long as we have existed. Other species have had to learn that about us. You are not the first power to declare something final about humanity. You won't be the last, but I would like to believe you might be the last to misread us quite so completely. The tribunal ruling came through in 5 hours and 53 minutes. It was unambiguous. It was devastating to 11 careers, and it came with a secondary recommendation, unprecedented in council history, that the legal framework for preemptive conflict declaration be substantially revised, with human diplomatic representatives invited to contribute to the revision, given their demonstrated expertise in the relevant compact provisions. The humans accepted, formally, with a 31-page response submitted 41 minutes after the invitation was received. Arbiter Thesivane retrieved the classified transmission from the footnote of history 6 months later. Read it again. The timestamp, 14 minutes before. They sat with it for a long time, in the same stillness they had sat in on the day they buried it. Then they wrote a private note, not for the record, not for the archive, but for themselves, that said only, they filed the end before we filed the beginning, and then they waited for us to catch up. They did not send it anywhere. Some realizations are too large for an archive. Some understandings arrive after every official record has already closed. Thesivane folded the note and set it beside the transmission and looked out at the star charts covering their office wall. All the systems, all the civilizations, all the declarations and resolutions and rulings that constituted the known shape of galactic civilization. And for the first time in 47 years of jurisprudence, Thessavane felt something unfamiliar. Not fear of what humanity was, not awe of what humanity had done, something quieter and more permanent than both. The specific, irreversible discomfort of understanding that you had encountered something that did not fit any category you had spent your life building. The humans had not won the war by being stronger. They had not won it by being smarter, or faster, or technologically superior, or destined for anything. They had won it by understanding, at a depth that no galactic power had ever been required to understand, that the universe does not run on force. It runs on time, and legitimacy, and records, and patience. And the accumulated weight of every person who stood in an occupied city, let themselves be documented, drank tea with the soldiers who had come to pacify them, and waited, absolutely certain, in a way that no model or projection or predictive framework had ever successfully captured, that the long view would eventually arrive at a truth that the short view could not see. Every rational civilization would have surrendered on day 2, or fought on day 1. The humans had done neither. They had simply continued, documenting, waiting, building their case 1 hour at a time, one signature at a time, one cold orbital installation and one untriggered weapon at a time, with the patient certainty of a species that had learned not from theory, but from the deep scar tissue of its own long history, that you cannot defeat an idea by occupying the ground beneath it. You can only wait for the idea to be heard. And they had waited, and the idea had been heard. And somewhere in the European zone, in a city that was already being quietly, systematically, meticulously restored to exactly the state it had been in before the first soldier landed, General Mara Voss was sitting in a room 40 kilometers from where she'd been for 7 weeks, reading the tribunal ruling and not celebrating. Not, Vorathesson suspected, because she wasn't relieved, but because she had known, from the moment she filed the first document in the first 31 minutes, how this would end. They always had. That was the thing that would keep Thessavane awake, not the war, not the legal defeat, not the 11 careers it had cost or the political restructuring it had required. The thing that would not let Thessavane sleep was simpler and more unsettling than any of it. Somewhere in that first 48-hour window, while the Council had been issuing ultimatums and the Strategic Directorate had been running its models, and the fleet had been reading its projections, 11 billion humans had looked at the war that had just been declared against their species and had not panicked, had not despaired, had moved with the calm efficiency of people executing a plan they had worked out long before it was needed, because they were a species that had learned, through every catastrophe and conquest and near extinction in their long, complicated, blood-soaked history, to think about the long game before the short one had even begun. The galaxy thought it had declared war on Earth. Earth had filed a legal brief. And somewhere in that gap, that small, 14-minute, apparently clerical, apparently unremarkable gap between when the declaration was decided and when it was delivered, the humans had already decided how it would end. They had just been waiting for everyone else